You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 15th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, ceasefire talks on Gaza are scheduled to start today. Hamas isn't going. So what can happen at negotiations some see are key to stopping a wider regional conflict? We'll look at that and also the role that the US can play as it says the talks should go ahead. Our senior news editor Chris Chermak is here. Good morning, Chris. What's your take on this?
Good morning, Emma. This is being billed as a sort of last gasp effort for the Biden administration to secure some kind of ceasefire deal. We'll look at what kind of leverage exactly Joe Biden has over Israel or Hamas.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Also coming up,
I'm Sheena Rossiter, a contributing editor, and I'll be talking about all things climate news, like the fallout of the Trump-Musk interview on X, and why Katy Perry is getting investigated by an environmental ministry in Spain.
More from Sheena a little later. Plus, we'll ask what next for Thailand after the Prime Minister is removed from office by the Constitutional Court. And next time you buy a giant chocolate Toblerone at duty free, beware that famous bar of soft power may not be as Swiss as you think. We'll find out more later. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in the news. 2 fighter pilots have died in northeastern France after their Rafale jets collided mid-air. Several Japanese government ministers have visited the controversial Yasukuni shrine, seen as a symbol of the country's aggression, as part of events to mark Japan's defeat in World War II. And Sweden's government is to get help from its Nordic neighbours to help deal with gang crime. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, let's assess the latest situation in the Middle East as more ceasefire talks are scheduled to be held today. Hamas has already said it's not going to the negotiations in Qatar. There had been hopes that any negotiated truce could hold off an attack by Iran on Israel. The talks also take place 2 days after the US agreed to send $3.5 billion to Israel to spend on US-made weapons and military equipment. Well, I'm joined now by Alison Kaplan-Sommer, journalist for Haaretz, and by Monocle senior news editor Chris Chermak. Good morning, Alison.
Good morning.
And good morning to you, Chris.
Good morning, Emma.
Good to have you both with us. Alison, just explain the context for this. The US is expecting these talks to go ahead in Qatar, but do we know who's at them?
Well, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, after many, many weeks of foot dragging and changes of conditions of participating in such talks, has decided to send a full delegation, which includes all of Israel's military and intelligence chiefs to Qatar, which is a huge gesture on his part. And so it shows at least a demonstration of a willingness and a seriousness to talk at a time when Israel is deeply dependent on the United States umbrella of protection when it's facing this direct threat, this extended threat by both Iran and Hezbollah to launch a massive attack against Israel. So I think that has really sort of pushed his hand towards participating in full negotiations. In order to not anger the Biden administration at such a delicate time.
This is an incredibly delicate time, isn't it, Chris? Because we have, as Alison has just said, a need for Israel not to push the US too hard. But also, we have these talks being seen as much bigger now, as a vital moment to stop a wider regional conflict.
They are absolutely vital for that. You've heard U.S. President Joe Biden stress this week that he believes that a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas would stop Iran from retaliating against Israel. So that really is this broad context that we're dealing with here. And I think it's interesting to Alison's point there about Israel And Netanyahu kind of in the past maybe moving the goalposts a little bit. That's arguably why I think these talks, you get the sense, will sort of start almost with the U.S. and Israel. Much has been made of the fact that Hamas will not be attending at this point. But that said, there's been various points over the last month or so, or a couple of months really, where the Biden administration has shifted who it's blaming, if you will, for the lack of a ceasefire. At points it said that, the ball is in Hamas's court. At points it said the ball is in Israel's court. At this point, it does feel like it's more about Israel and the U.S. almost getting on the same page, getting Netanyahu to agree with some of the goalposts he's moved about, whether it's sort of border controls, checkpoints within Gaza, and then they would sort of go back to Hamas to see if a deal can actually be put through.
And there's also this added pressure, or the announcement earlier on this week, Alison, about this enormous sum that the US will send to Israel, $3.5 billion that Israel will be able to spend on US-made weapons and military equipment. How much does that complicate things?
That definitely figures into Israel's consideration. I would just throw into the mix the fact that the change in the 2024 race. Remember, the Democratic National Convention is coming up, and I think that while Netanyahu previously he wasn't betting completely on a Donald Trump victory, but it seemed much more likely. And I think the fact that the Harris campaign is so much stronger, and the prospect of another Democratic White House is so much more possible, is also, I think, figuring into his considerations of how conciliatory to be towards the Biden administration.
Let's talk a little bit, Chris, now about the fact that Hamas is not going to be there, but there is, in all likelihood, the mediators who will be around the table will be talking to Hamas afterwards. I mean, who is actually going to be around the table, and how much difference does Hamas's absence make to all this?
Well, it doesn't necessarily make that big of a difference, depending on if you want to be an optimist or a pessimist within this, because, as I said, the point arguably right now would be to get Israel on side as well. There will be U.S. representation. CIA Director Bill Burns will be there, which goes to Alison's point about all these sort of intelligence officials from the military and military from Israel's side being there. Qatar will be there. Egypt will be there. Qatar has said that they will ensure that Hamas has representation, if you will, whether that is Hamas itself or through an intermediary. And then there are clear signs that whatever will happen in this first step, if you will, if there is some kind of significant movement towards a ceasefire deal and a framework is more clearly in place, then this would go back to Hamas at some later point in the coming days to see whether they can agree to it or not. Also important to say, I think, that Egypt, Qatar, and the U.S. have quite clearly said on this that whatever happens, if you will, they are going to present something. So if Israel and Hamas do not agree to a deal themselves, they will present a deal that they will try to get both sides to agree to, and sort of hamstring this through.
Alison, tell us a little bit more about the extra additional edge to all this. The fact that Iran and its regional proxies have said that they will retaliate against Israel for the assassination of two of its militant leaders. This puts an enormous amount of extra pressure on these talks. I mean, as if the pressure wasn't hard enough.
Yes, well, this linkage that the United States is presenting, that presumably comes from sources linked to Iran. We imagine there are some significant channels between the U.S. and Iran, that there's going to be a direct connection between the ability to reach a deal at this summit and the existence or the ferocity, or, it's going to have an effect on what kind of retaliatory attack that Hezbollah and Iran launches on Israel is going to be a huge factor, because, the main incentive that Israel had going into the talks is obviously, ending the hostilities and returning the hostages and making border residents in the north and south be able to return to their homes, which was a significant significant incentive to compromise, but obviously not enough given the political pressures on Netanyahu from his right flank not to compromise. But now, if you add into the mix the fact that reaching a deal could also spare Israel from this, huge, massive regional conflict on multiple fronts, which would be disastrous, is obviously, hopefully, moves the needle in favor of making certain compromises that it wasn't willing to make previously.
And staying with you, Alice, and just looking at, I think there's an article in the Financial Times this morning that talks about the prospect of, how to deal with Benjamin Netanyahu. And one person is quoted as saying, everyone knows what Netanyahu doesn't want, but no one knows what he does.
Well, what he definitely wants is to stay prime minister. And he is, in a sense, being, changed to these far-right members of his coalition, Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who are absolutely uncompromising. And so, therefore, he does want to remain in power, and he is, justifiably afraid that if he makes a compromise in which he ends the war with something short of his declared goals at the beginning, which were total victory and the elimination of Hamas as a ruling power in Gaza, that these coalition members will bolt his government and it will collapse and lead to new elections.
Chris, how much realistic progress can we expect from Doha?
Oh man, not a huge amount. If I want to be a little more pessimistic at this point, from the sense I've gotten even of listening to U.S. President Joe Biden, he is less optimistic at this point than he has been at some other points. He's been pushing for a deal for over a month now. So the question more is going to be whether they can force any kind of deal and have really leverage over either side. But to Alison's point there as well, I mean, Israel, on the one hand, Netanyahu faces his right-wing flank, and then on Hamas's side, of course, with Ismail Haniyeh not the leader anymore, and Yahya Sinwar taking over now, he is more of a hardline figure for Hamas as well. So when you look at negotiators, also U.S. negotiators, former negotiators for the Middle East, they talk about the fact that the leaders in place right now are far more extreme and have less incentive than they might have had in the past to actually reach a deal.
Chris Chermack, thank you so much. And thanks also to Alison Kaplan-Sommer. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. 13:13 in Bangkok, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, the Prime Minister of Thailand, Seta Thavisin, has been stripped of his office. It follows a decision by the country's constitutional court over Mr. Seta's appointment to his cabinet of a former lawyer who was once jailed. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by James Chambers, Monocle's Asia editor based in Bangkok. Welcome back to London, James.
Good to be here.
You leave the country just when they lose a Prime Minister. Good timing.
That's right. I actually flew back from Bangkok on Tuesday, and I left the country thinking that actually the Prime Minister would keep his job. Most people did think that he would survive this case, and it was a 5-4 decision by the court. So it was a close one, but it didn't go the Prime Minister's way, and Thailand is now looking for a new leader, and that's not what we were expecting.
No. So, okay, just explain to us, what happened last week? What, from the moment that you got on the plane to the moment that you landed in London, clearly things changed. So what happened?
Well, the thing about, one of the many things to know about Thailand and the way everything works is, it's easy to think there's some big master plan, some grand plan, and there's one person at the top pulling all the strings. But that's not how it all works. And this was it was a legal case that was brought against the Prime Minister for making this very dodgy appointment to one of his during his last cabinet reshuffle. He appointed this former lawyer who was very close to the former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, who had been prosecuted for trying to bribe judges in the past, for trying to, in a case involving Thaksin. He eventually got convicted of contempt of court and served time in 2008. But, when it comes to his moral and ethical standards, they were very questionable. And there is a provision in the Constitution that ministers have to meet certain ethical standards. So even when the Prime Minister made this appointment, it just looked very fishy. It did. People were rolling their eyes. And it did seem like a decision that he wouldn't have made himself, but was probably made for him by Thaksin, who is in Thailand and essentially the patriarch of the Pheu Party, which Prime Minister Seta is a part of.
It's interesting you've just said that no one person pulls the strings, and yet what you have just said suggests something different.
Well, I say no one person, but there are several figures in this big chess game who have a lot of sway. So there is Thaksin, who's meant to be retired. He came back to Thailand after over 15 years in kind of this self-imposed exile, kind of wriggled his way out of a jail term, and everyone assumes he made some kind of grand deal to essentially go into retirement and go quiet. He's not done that. He's been very active, and this kind of what we're seeing now. People use this term lawfare. Everyone's seeing it as a kind of a backlash against Thaksin returning and exerting his influence over Pheu and over the Prime Minister. And this is the conservative elite saying, actually, no, we're not going to stand for that. We want you to honour this grand deal and actually go quietly, go into retirement.
So just going back to Mr. Seta's departure, This is a decision made, as you said, with a narrow majority in the Constitutional Court. But questions are being asked about the amount of power that this court wields, and the fact that Seta and his supporters have said that this is a wholly political decision. This is,
they were foolish enough to provide them with an opportunity to do this. Everything that's happened has been by the book, but the people who brought this claim against, or alleged this thing against the Prime Minister, were a bunch of senators who'd been appointed by the former military government, and they were on their way out, and they decided they were going to petition the court to try and get rid of the Prime Minister on these grounds. And so everything has been done by the book, although that book was written by the generals who led the last coup. But Pheu and Thaksin and the Prime Minister Seta were daft enough to give them this opportunity to get rid of him. So yes, of course, it is very political. No one expected the Prime Minister to be taken down by this because it didn't seem worthy. And actually, he's been doing a pretty good job representing Thailand and trying to get the economy going. So for him to go on these grounds, it does seem like Thailand shooting itself in the foot.
And this does place Thailand once again in a position of political instability, doesn't it? This is the third Prime Minister in 16 years who's been removed.
It does, and then it's a week after the Move Forward Party was dissolved. But the surprising thing about Thailand is that if you look at it from afar, there's a lot of instability right now. But actually, these decisions have been everyone's kind of shrugging and moving on. Last week we saw Move Forward within a matter of days, reform into a new party. And right now, Pheu have basically decided that one of their other picks for leader, a party stalwart called Chai Kasem Nitisiri, they're going to put him forward. They've got the votes in Parliament. So by tomorrow, when there's going to be a vote in Parliament, Thailand will have a new Prime Minister and it'll be another Pheu person. So we've had these two very dramatic moments in the last week that should cause instability in any country. But actually in Thailand, where they're kind of used to this, everyone's already prepared and they've adjusted very quickly.
And in terms of the way that internally in Thailand people deal with this, you mentioned that's you've almost spoken with them at a certain degree of levity about how quickly they can turn things around. Do the population of Thailand actually feel much of this change?
On the street, Thailand is one of those places where you can have tanks on the streets after a coup, and yet everything's still, life is still normal. There's still tourists coming in. It's almost in the past been a bit of a tourist attraction. But that's not to say that these clashes especially between Thaksin and the conservative elites in the past have got ugly. There have been, deadly protests on the streets this century. And the good thing is, we're not there. This is all happening, I guess, above above street level Thai life. And it's a big political game. And actually, the big damage is that people just have no respect for politicians, and that's just not going to help this at all. And it explains why there's so much support for Move Forward or the People's Party, because they're seen as genuine, they're seen as clean, they're seen as people who can kind of move Thailand beyond this mess, because what's happening now is not good for Thailand's reputation abroad. It's not good for the reputation of politicians in Thailand, and things need to change. And it's not going to happen under Thai.
What is going to happen to Thailand's reputation abroad following this?
Well, I mean, the sad thing is, Prime Minister Srettha Thavisin, he's a property tycoon. He's a businessman. He was doing a great job overseas. He was flying to Davos. He was flying to Japan. He was flying to Hong Kong. He was in the US representing Thailand, and he was a great face for the country overseas, and this face of change. And he was his main thing was just trying to get the economy going again, trying to attract investment, and that's what he's good at. And he was doing a great job. But at the same time, at home, his reputation was being tarnished. He was being ripped to pieces for his love of foreign travel and being out of the country so much. So overseas, it's obviously going to change, because this new guy, if he gets appointed tomorrow, Niti Siri, he's not got the same stature, and he'll be seen as much more of a puppet of Thaksin than Srettha ever was. I guess the interesting thing we're all waiting to see now was whether Thai would put forward Thaksin's daughter, Pai Tongtan, to be the candidate to be Prime Minister. She's 37, she's young, she's fresh, she can get people excited, but there's a hesitancy about whether she's going to step up or when she's going to step up, because it's so volatile right now that if she's appointed but we're removed within a month, that's the end of Thaksin and his dynasty. So they're just waiting for the right moment to put her forward, and they've decided that this isn't that moment.
James, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. Good to see you. Still to come on today's programme.
Toblerone, out on its own, triangular chocolate, that's Toblerone.
It may well be triangular, but there's something else making Swiss farmers so cross about Toblerone. Find out a little later on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
7:22 here in London. Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Paul Waldy, Europe correspondent at the Globe and Mail. Welcome back, Paul. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Good to have you with us. So we have on the menu this morning, what? Viruses, fire, crime and stones.
Nice combination for an August morning.
Absolutely. It's sort of the apocalyptic collection. Where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with fires. I mean, Canada, of course, had a nasty, awful wildfire season last year, 2023. 45 million acres of forest fires, 6,000 plus fires. And what's interesting now is there's a study coming out looking at what was the climate impact on this. And all forest fires around the world last year generated about 8.6 billion tons of carbon emissions. And Canada's fires accounted for about a quarter of that. And I think the issue here now is what's going to happen going forward with climate change. And what happened last year was all of these dry conditions and other factors that accounted for these fires and accounted for such a bad year are only going to increase as time goes on. And that this, by something like, in the next decade or few decades or so, these kinds of fires are going to become much more common. And I think that's the big concern. And the other issue for Canada is that wildfire emissions aren't included in Canada's kind of overall carbon emissions, and certainly not part of its carbon emission targets. So that's another factor, that this is kind of in addition to whatever Canada's trying to do in terms of reducing its carbon emissions.
Now, the difficulty that journalists have is when something becomes increasingly normal, it becomes increasingly harder to report because people get used to it. It loses its unusual touch. How do you go about making sure that this thing still stays relevant?
Well, that is a fact. I mean, I think what we've seen even this year is Jasper, big fire in Jasper, which has caught an awful lot of attention because of its kind of global significance, and it's such a beautiful spot that it's now become part of the whole wildfire season this year. So I think as those kinds of things start to happen, people are going to take stand up and take more notice of this. And I just think the scale of the fires last year, when you're evacuating, small-sized cities, when you're evacuating more towns because the fires are creeping in, and you're seeing that not just in Canada but in other places. Greece this year, of course, is going through quite a dramatic season as well. People are going to start to say, what's going on here? Why is this happening so often?
Okay. Let's move to a story that's made the global headlines. The World Health Organization has declared Mpox a global health emergency. This is something that started where it's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, isn't it? And about 450 people died there. Mpox was around a couple of years ago, not seen as a terribly serious disease, but this new strain has really caused alarm.
Yeah, the new strain has caused alarm, and I guess we've all become much more acutely aware of this because of COVID and what happened a few years ago. And there's a new strain of this that's more deadly. The initial strain is something around, 1 in 100 people might die from it. This one is closer to 10% of people possibly can die from it. It's affecting a lot of children. It's spread beyond kind of the homosexual community and that, which was the initial virus. Now it's spreading just close contact at all, apparently can spread this virus. And it's spreading to countries that have never seen Mpox before, 13-odd countries surrounding Democratic Republic of Congo. So I think what the WHO is doing here, because we've heard these warnings now for several days, but what they've done by making this declaration is trying to get global mobilization for vaccines and to produce vaccines. There are 2 vaccines for Mpox that are pretty effective, but they're just not nearly enough doses. And I think the issue now is to crank that up, to get to the level where millions of people can be vaccinated and maybe develop new vaccines, similar to what we saw in COVID when we had the mRNA vaccines being developed. There is some talk that they're trying to develop one for Mpox and smallpox, which is a related virus. And that's, I think, why the WHO has taken this step. They're trying to get the rest of the world engaged in this.
Indeed, because when the WHO issues a global emergency, that's its highest level of alert. I wonder how much people have learned from COVID in order to galvanise and to work together at speed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real fear that we haven't learned that much, and simply because of economics, that had this outbreak occurred in Western Europe or North America, we'd be having vaccines right away, just like we did in COVID. Because it's happening in Africa, there's a sense that, we can wait a little while. There won't be quite the urgency that there was for COVID-19, and that's a real concern.
Okay, let's move to a story here in the United Kingdom, in London. Covering it in The Guardian. The UK's biggest police force is providing inadequate or failing services in 7 of 8 key crime-fighting areas. There are serious concerns about the Metropolitan Police's management of dangerous offenders. That's according to an official inspection. I mean, this report, it's been called as devastating, isn't it? And it comes off the back of an awful lot of reports which have raised concerns about the Met.
That's the problem. I mean, the Met has been under what they call this kind of inspection or inspection measures for 2 years now. And of course, there's been a lot of reports about failings in different areas. This one is kind of more of a sweeping condemnation. It's saying 7 of 9 areas that they look at, it is still failing and needs improvement. And that's pretty similar to where it stood 2 years ago. And a couple of notable areas. One is monitoring sexual offenders. They're supposed to do visits of these people and sort of monitor what they're doing, and they're not. And in one case, one serious sexual offender had not been visited in 6 years, and they're actually notifying them before they show up, which they're not supposed to do. So that's a real concern. And then the other one is just basic solving crimes. I mean, apparently the Met, according to this report, solves about half the crimes of other police forces in England and Wales. So there's a real worry about just what they're doing on these 2 levels as opposed to many others. So I think this will put some pressure on Mark Rowley, the new commissioner, the new head of the Met. He's only been there for a couple of years. He's promised all kinds of changes, which everyone says would put the force in the right direction, but they're just not seeing any results yet.
Indeed, I mean, this report reflects on something that was happening a couple of years ago, and that there is now a new Met for London plan, which in theory is supposed to address a lot of these problems, try and get some wholesale change. But this article in The Guardian raises the fact that, you talked about the Met Police Commissioner, Mark Rowley, that the majority of those in power do trust him to get the job. However, if he does fall here, there is no plan B.
Well, exactly. And I mean, he has talked a big game about making change, and everybody's waiting, and everybody's saying, yes, what he wants to do will work. It's whether it's trickling down and getting down to the base level and getting down to the level where it can make a difference. And that just hasn't happened yet. And so they're going to stay in these emergency measures for some time until they fix some of these problems.
Finally, Stonehenge.
Yes, Stonehenge.
What's happening there? Not much is happening there. It's been there a while. What has happened there that people didn't know had happened there?
Well, apparently, I mean, everybody's been trying to understand where these rocks came from. And by and large, scientific evidence has proven that established that some of the rocks came from not too far away. Some of them came from Wales. But there was a couple in particular that they didn't understand where these rocks could have come from. They're called these altar stones. And apparently now new research has found or is establishing that these rocks could well have come from northern Scotland, from Inverness or even further up to the Orkney Islands. And that raises a whole bunch of questions about, A, how they got them there, and B, it tells you a lot more about these Neolithic communities and how socially engaged they were and how maybe more advanced they were than we thought. Did they send them by ship? Did they drag them over land? You're talking 5-6 ton stones being dragged 500 miles. So it raises an awful lot of questions, A, about Stonehenge, and B, about who these people were that were building it.
One day they'll find a prehistoric lorry. I guarantee it. Paul Waldie, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is 7:30. A quick look at some of the headlines from today. Ukraine says its forces have advanced further into Russia. Kyiv says its gains will offer what it called a strategic buffer zone to protect its border areas from Russian attacks. Kyiv's surge into Russian territory last week caught Moscow by surprise. 2 fighter pilots have died in France after their Rafale jets collided mid-air. The French President Emmanuel Macron paid tribute to the 2 men, the trainer and student pilot. A third pilot was found safely after ejecting following the crash. The supersonic Rafale fighter jets have become a worldwide bestseller for the French arms industry. Several Japanese government ministers have visited a controversial shrine seen as a symbol of the country's aggression. The visit to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo was made as part of events to mark Japan's defeat in World War II. 14 prominent convicted war criminals are among the war dead honoured at the shrine. And Sweden's government is to get help from its neighbours to help deal with gang crime. There'll be an increased police cooperation and the creation of a new hub in Stockholm as part of an effort to stop Sweden's gang problems from spreading to Norway, Finland and Denmark. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 7:32 here in London now. New Zealand is seeing a sharp rise in the number of people leaving. Higher interest rates, low economic growth and an uncertain jobs market have all collaborated to a brain drain from a country commonly celebrated for its quality of life. Well, I'm joined now by Natalia Sutherland, a reporter based in New Zealand. I think still, Natalia. Very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you too.
So you've not left yet, but just explain to us what's gone wrong.
What's gone wrong? Well, frankly, there are no jobs in New Zealand. For a lot of people that are unemployed or have been made redundant over the last 6 months, they're finding themselves without work. Their job market, as you've just mentioned before, has significantly shrunk. Compared to last year, job ads have dropped by about 27%. We got a snapshot last week of what the unemployment rate looks like to give us a good grasp of how we're actually faring at the moment. And the unemployment rate has gone up from around about 4.3% to 4.7% in the last couple of months. Now, that's expected to get much worse by the end of the year to around 5%, and some negative predictions show that it could rise as high as 5.5%. Now, it's kind of not unexpected considering the current climate that we're in with high interest rates and high inflation. But a lot of that unemployment is fueled by the government's dramatic slash of the public sector over the last 6 months, and a slash that is still actually ongoing. We had another one today where 300 public servants lost their jobs as well, taking the total to around 4,000 people out of work. And it's also affecting the private sector too, where around 700 people have lost their jobs this year. Now, that's due to employers trying to save costs, with the central bank being hawkish about its approach to inflation and trying to bring that down as fast as possible. So to do that, they need to reduce their heads count. Now, this is all something also the Central Bank of New Zealand has been quite blatant about over the last 4 years, that if we want interest rates to drop and to see inflation fall back to around that 1 to 3% mark, that the head count needs to be reduced. Our market has been too hot throughout COVID, and we just need to grin and bear these unemployment numbers. So it's not really unexpected to see people looking for better work opportunities outside of the country.
How did this exodus? How was this exodus noticed? I mean, did people just suddenly start to slip away, or has there been this perception that actually jobs aren't being filled and there just aren't as many young people around anymore?
Well, I think New Zealand being such a small place as it is, it's easy to bump into someone who has been made redundant, or to talk to people who have applied for a job where 80 to 90 other people have applied for the same role. Talking to some recruiters over the last couple of months, certain jobs like admin jobs can get 200 applicants. So people are really struggling to find work. And anyone who you talk to and you bump on the street is doing it tough. So the exodus has been known by basically people selling up and moving overseas. We've also got Stats New Zealand that tracks that migration number too, and they have released numbers recently showing the staggering 131,000 people have left New Zealand, 80,000 of those being New Zealand citizens.
Where are they going?
Well, really easy jump straight over to Australia. Around a third of that 131,000 have left to Australia in the last year. And that's despite their own economic woes at the moment with high unemployment and high interest rates. But they have been specifically targeting Kiwis. If you go on any local government state websites over there, you'll see specific ads trying to lure early childhood educators over, healthcare workers and our police force over to work in their sectors that are struggling to be filled at the moment. And the packages are very luring. You could move your entire family, get $10,000 to $20,000 worth of moving costs to move and fill in these vacancies over there, with also significant jump in salary.
And just tell us, you are one of these, aren't you? You are packing your bags and going yourself, Natalia.
Well, it's looking that way. I unfortunately have been part of the bloodbath that has been the mass redundancies in our news media over here. I was contracting for one of the biggest broadcast networks over here that was owned by an American company, which closed the doors earlier this year, where around 300 people lost their jobs. But with hiring freezes across the sector here, a lot of us have had to look to Australia and the UK to find work.
And how do you feel about that?
It's been tough. As most journalists can tell you, we never want to be a part of the story. So it has been difficult to see the industry that you've trained for come to an end, essentially, for some of us. And to make that decision to pack up and find work elsewhere has not been in the plan. So I would say it's been tough, but also interesting from a journalist's point of view to see how it's all playing out.
Indeed. I mean, finally, just tell us what it would take to make you stay and make the other members of your generation stay.
It would just be work, to be able to stay in New Zealand and work in the industry that you've been trained in.
Natalia Sutherland, we wish you the very best of luck. Thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, the Olympics may be over, but the legacy of Paris 2024 lives on as urban planners and policymakers explore what lessons can be learned from the success of the French Games for future sporting events. One of those is Istanbul, which will host the upcoming 4th edition of the European Games. And I caught up with the city's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, at a celebration of the 2027 European Games at Istanbul House in Paris last week. Ekrem began by talking to me through an interpreter to describe how preparations are going.
Avrupa oyunları çok genç bir.
The European Games is a very young organization and it has a great potential to be developed further in the future. And I see those European Games as a rehearsal also for future Olympic Games. Of course, we will strengthen this European Games as an organization and we will take it to a further step. And Paris is offering very good examples of hosting the sports competitions in iconic venues, temporary sports facilities, the harmony of everything that is being done for the Olympics with the city, and the fact that the city has been transformed to host more green areas, more pedestrian zones. All these are very good examples, and these issues have already been in our urban agenda for Istanbul for some time already.
Bana verdiği öncü duygular bunlar.
Could you see Istanbul doing the same thing as Paris, using the city inside, the buildings that you have, the water that you have, to play host to sport? I mean, is there capacity within Istanbul for that to happen?
Kesinlikle bu kapasiteye sahip.
Absolutely, Istanbul has the capacity to host such Olympic Games, as minimum as in Paris. Of course, Paris is offering a very strong example. We are grateful to them, but we have the capability to develop this to a further level. I can see and I feel it, and I'm very excited to see this potential. And just like Paris has its river, we have the Bosphorus Strait, we have different seas, we have the magnificent Golden Horn. These venues are very good venues to host many different sports branches as well as different monuments that we have within the city. And I think we have the capability to surprise the whole world with everything that we can do. Of course, this is a dream for the future, but everyone knows that Istanbul is preparing to host further sports events in the future, and we are very grateful to Paris.
Umarım bir gün bunu başaracağız.
You talk there about surprises. What could you surprise us with in Istanbul when you're hosting enormous sports events?
İstanbul doğası zaten aslında sürprizlerle
Well, the natural landscape of Istanbul is already full of surprises, but on top of that we have a very creative and a very young society. So it's not my place to describe the surprises that the city can offer, but it will be the creative and young society that will show future surprises. So for that, I invite you to attend the European Games and also after that the Olympic Games, so that we can all together witness the surprises the city can offer.
Ev sahipliğine davet ediyorum. Sürprizleri birlikte yaşayalım.
And just tell us a little bit about the questions that are always asked when you have big sporting events. Are things like, is the infrastructure of the city able to absorb a big event such as an Olympics or a European Games? And secondly, what could an enormous Games do to create a legacy and to improve the quality of life of people in Istanbul? How would it help?
Kesinlikle spor organizasyonlar.
Istanbul is capable to host sporting events because it has proven its capability in the past. As you know, we have organized many finals of European sporting events. We are going to host the 2027 European Games. It's going to be a multi-branch event. And we are also preparing to host the European Soccer Championship in 2032. And besides this, we are also working very heavily on constructing infrastructure. Only in the past 6 years, we have completed the construction of 5 metro lines out of 10 metro lines that are planned, and we are working on other metro projects. The city itself is a big investor, so we have other investments that are ongoing, and I am sure that we will be ready for the European Games and also for future other sporting events.
Ya da bunu söyleyin isterseniz.
There is often the issue of money when it comes to hosting enormous events. Turkey's economy is in quite an interesting period. If you decide to do lots of investment into the space, how much do you think that the residents of Istanbul and indeed the population of Turkey, what do you think that they will think of if there's a large bill? Because there are always questions asked about spending money.
Türkiye'nin economic
Yes, the country is currently undergoing economic problems due to mistaken economic policies that have been implemented. But we know that the country has the capacity to surmount this. And the investments that are needed for the Olympic Games are not scary in the sense that the return is so immense emotionally, from a sports point of view, politically, from a tourism and culture point of view, etc. And I know very clearly that the costs that we will incur for the European Games are not going to be excessive, and all the facilities that we'll build will be helpful in the future.
Ev sahipliğimiz için çok kolaylaştırıcı bir pozisyon.
I'm going to be in real trouble for asking this question, so I'm going to ask it really quickly. We've seen lots of new sports being introduced at Olympic Games. You have a very impressive wall next door on oil wrestling. Is that ever going to make an appearance in any major games in Istanbul?
Why not? Biz aslında
Well, we've been working on hosting oil wrestling events in Istanbul for the Istanbulites to have a better feeling of those events for the last 3 years. And the belt that is displayed outside is the belt that is given to the champion. So my answer to your question is why not? Let me say that this sport has a history of 7 centuries. It's maybe one of the most ancient sporting events in the world. I don't know if we can propose this to the IOC, but we'll work on it. And also, maybe the problematic point is, you know, that Olympic Games need to be organized in a very equal manner from a gender equality point of view. Oil wrestling is only practiced by men, so I'm not sure if this is going to fit the Olympic spirit. But I would like to underline how happy I am to know that 52% of Team Turkey is composed of women.
Olimpiyat Komitesi'ne bilmiyorum ama bunun üzerine çalışalım.
That was Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, speaking to me at Istanbul House in Paris last week. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's time now on The Globalist to talk climate with Sheena Rossiter, Monocle's contributing editor in Edmonton, Canada. A very good morning to you, Sheena.
Well, good evening. Good morning to you, yes.
It's good evening where you are, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Okay, right. Well, we'll try and work that one out for ourselves a little bit later. But first, tell us what's happening in climate.
Well, one of the big stories that still continues to make headlines is Trump. You know, he doesn't really escape the headlines as much as we try to make it happen. Even though this interview happened a few days ago, still very much on the headlines. And I'm talking about the Elon Musk interview with Donald Trump on X, or the platform that we more commonly call as Twitter. Trump hasn't been particularly active on the platform since he was banned after the January 6, 2021 insurrection. And Donald Trump and Elon Musk, they had this really long sort of, as they like to call it, conversation where they made these kind of fact-free assertions about global warming and almost kind of poked fun at saying that rising sea levels would, quote, create more oceanfront property and that there was no real urgent need to cut any carbon emissions. Comments that they also agreed on were that there was plenty of time to move away from fossil fuels if we even need to do it at all. And this just dominated the conversation around climate change. And Musk, who is a guy who started an electric car company, so this doesn't really ooze with irony at all. Musk, meanwhile, he he said it was wrong to, quote, vilify the oil and gas industry, and that the key driver of planet heating pollution, that it's not only imperative to ditch fossil fuels, that they were, one day it was just kind of going to be run dry.
Just explain to us how much of an impact something like a conversation between these two men has on the relationship with climate change that the world has. I mean, does it suddenly cause a huge, dangerous amount of influence?
Absolutely, especially as we're on the heels of the 2024 presidential election in the United States. Kamala Harris is definitely gaining a lot of steam, but Donald Trump still absolutely has a lot of voters and will give her a run for her money. So having an interview between these two very powerful men, especially Elon Musk, also a very polemic figure himself, but he still also has a lot of fans too. So the fact that they had this conversation, it was a bit disastrous. It was 40 minutes delayed in the first place, and there was a lot going on with it. But the fact that people are still talking about it, including us, days later, it says a lot. And the main thing that the mainstream media has touched upon is actually fact-checking what they said.
Okay, and of course the fact-checkers have been out in full force, haven't they?
Absolutely. So, it's been proven that governments have agreed on that global temperatures rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius is super dangerous. And that if the world doesn't start cutting emissions now and get to net zero by 2050, we could really experience the worst impacts. This has been proven by climate scientists, and despite Trump's claims of these new beaches that we could get it by having rising sea levels, we all know that is just not a good thing, that up to a foot of rising sea levels in the next 30 years, this will create just catastrophe across the United States, including significant flooding, which has already risen by 50% since the 1990s. And that would really affect millions of American homes in places like Florida, where Trump does live. In fact, some insurers have already gotten out of Florida because of the increased costs of flooding from rising sea levels in that state.
Let's move on to another story which has been making the headlines this week, that reports are coming out in terms of the amount of wildfires that the world is experiencing now.
Yeah, so we're really feeling it here, especially in Edmonton. It was quite a smoky day over here, where the air quality where I am was 10 plus on a scale of 10. So it was just pretty drastic with the smoke that we've been experiencing from the wildfires here. So now there is an annual report, which is basically called the State of the Wildfires Report. And this is in response to all the global wildfires that are happening, namely unprecedented fires here in Canada and parts of the Amazon. So they were at least 3 times more likely to happen due to climate change, and they contributed to astronomically high levels of CO2 emissions globally. For example, one researcher said that here in Canada, almost a decade worth of carbon emissions from fire were recorded from a single fire season. That's more than 2 billion tons of CO2, and this is just expected to exacerbate global warming.
And finally, tell us about the pop star Katy Perry. She's been filmed on a sand dune, and people have noticed that she probably shouldn't have been there.
Yes, so she's actually under investigation by the Environment Department in the Balearic Island states. They're investigating her because basically she was on a sand dune in this teeny tiny island that's called Es Palamador, and if you've never heard of it, it's probably because you weren't invited, because it's so small, it's privately owned, and it's uninhabited. So she filmed this new song, and the second track on it, in the video, she is on these sand dunes. And according to a statement from the Environmental Department that has launched the investigation, they said that the area where she was of great ecological value, and that they weren't assigned a permit and they didn't apply for a permit to film there, and that it was beyond, it was in a prohibited area that was marked by ropes. So they said, of course, it's not a crime on the environment to film a music video, but the problem is that the filming wasn't authorized on the requested property, and the production company responsible for the video clip did not apply for it. So that is what is actually under investigation, not the having fun in the sand dune.
And the issue is what? The fact that there is a potential that somebody could be causing damage to an environment which should be protected.
Exactly. That is the exact issue, is that had they wanted to actually film there, they probably could have filmed there had they applied for the right permit and got the correct authorization from the government. Because, of course, as we know, filming is a very expensive and costly and often taxing on the environment. You have large crews, you have a lot of equipment. And so if you're going on a sand dune and it's not within the specific parameters that are set out in the permit that authorizes this filming, you could increase ecological damage to the area. And that's the issue.
Sheena Rossiter, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Finally, Toblerone's about as Swiss as it gets. After all, it's arguably the highest-ranking soft power advert you'll ever find in the duty-free section of an airport. But things are changing. There's a fundamental change taking place. It may no longer contain Swiss milk. And Markus Schurgel is an associate professor at St. Gallen University, working at the Institute for Marketing, also a regular panellist on Monocle on Sunday. But I'm delighted to say he's taken time out of his holiday in Puglia to talk to us about this change. Good morning, Markus. Good to have you on the programme.
Good morning, Emma.
So just tell us, why on earth are they doing this?
Well, I think when you need to look at the whole chocolate industry and the consumer goods industry in general, when you look at the price competition that they have, and even on the supply side, cocoa is going up in prices like hell, and they need to compensate in a certain way for the costs that are coming up to them and keeping a competitive price. So looking at the supplier relationships, they're trying now to find out where they have a better position by using different milk. Well, and this is important, I think, not for the Swiss-produced stuff that they're still doing in Switzerland, but for the stuff that they're doing outside of Switzerland. They might be using a different milk that they're using right now. And the dairy industry is a little bit up the walls on this.
I would imagine so, and imagine that the Swiss dairy industry has something to say about it too.
Yes, of course. I mean, it's a highly regulated market, and they are about 25 million Swiss francs that they are talking about in business for the dairy industry, for the dairy farmers, that are pretty protected in the Swiss industry policies, because they want to have a self-supply in Switzerland. And this is harming their business tremendously.
How much do you think that this could harm the Toblerone brand?
Well, I think you need to put that into a different context and look a little bit what Toblerone has been doing in the last, let's say, 18 months. So they moved out of having a Swiss quality and made in Switzerland argumentation, because by legislation, they're not producing and not anymore more than 80% of the chocolate in Switzerland. So they rebranded their packaging. They took off the Matterhorn, and they redescribed it as Swiss-founded quality. So they have been working already on moving out of that Swissness argumentation a little bit. But, you know, from my point of view, I think that this brand is a very resilient brand, because many people learned that Toblerone is from Switzerland. It is founded in Switzerland. So I'm not quite sure that the quality of the dairy product in itself might be harming that brand too much outside of Switzerland. Within Switzerland, it's going to be, and it is already in the newspapers, a little bit of turmoil with the consumers as well.
Very briefly, Markus, are we looking at a moment then when Mondelez have messed around with Milka, they've messed around with Cadbury, they're now messing around with Toblerone. Are we now at a point where brands overtake the things that make them great?
I think Mondelez is really playing a strategy that is, we're looking for global markets. So we're looking for the key pillar, key differentiator, the halo effect that we have on each brand, and cut down on the other effects that a global consumer wouldn't notice. From my point of view, looking at this from the perspective of Mondelez in itself, I'm sorry, in my hotel they're just cleaning up, so it's a little wondering. No, basically, and I think Mondelez is doing a global strategy and neglecting a lot of the local differences, which is a counter move to many brands that we see right now that are moving more into the local part. But I think they have a global strategy that is really cutting back on the key differentiators that many brands have.
Markus Schögl, thank you so much for joining us from your hotel room in Puglia. You're listening to The Globalist, and that's all the time we have for today's programme. Thanks to all my guests and to producers Vincent McAviney, Chris Chermack, Laura Kramer, researcher Sana Germani, and our studio manager Christy O'Grady. For now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thanks for listening.